Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Takshashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone and welcome to All Things Policy podcast of the Takshila Institution. I'm Abhishek Kadiyala. I'm a research analyst at Takshila Institution focusing on the US. Joining with me is Brigadier Anil Raman, who is also a research fellow at the Takshila Institution focusing on the US. Our guest for today is Soren Dayton, who is a director of governance at Foundation for American Innovation and is also a constitutional expert focusing on the US Congress for this point of the podcast. Thank you so much, Soren, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Soren, as we have seen, President Trump ordered the US strikes on Iran in late February 2026, which has escalated into an ongoing conflict. And from what we understand, no congressional authorization was sought, beforehand. And listeners and analysts in India have watched with concern how, when the war powers resolution was introduced in the Senate on April 15th and in the House on April 16th, the resolution basically did not pass. So for our listeners, could you first just explain what exactly the war powers resolution is? What are the implications of it in not getting passed? And what does this mean for the conflict ahead?
Sure. And to really understand the resolution that was passed, it's important to look back to 1973 when Congress passed what was also called the War Powers Resolution over the veto of then President Nixon, who said it was unconstitutional. And essentially, with some small changes, every president since then has said it was unconstitutional. So the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was passed in the context of the Vietnam War. And it says that Congress must be consulted when there is an introduction of United States forces into hostilities. And Congress must ultimately approve. And this derives its logic from Article 1 of the Constitution. I forget which Article 1, section, whatever, that says that Congress declares war. Now, the idea here, originally, that is way back when the Constitution was created, was that Congress needs to approve an act of war and then provide funds to do it. Now, in a world where the military is pretty well funded. I forget what exactly, Anil probably knows the number better than me, what the appropriation was to the U.S. military this year. It's probably something like 1.2 trillion or U.S. dollars. You don't necessarily need to go get money. However, under the War Powers Resolution, members of Congress can introduce resolutions to terminate an action. And this is what happened. And so there's a bunch of questions here that turn on what is legal, what is required, and what people can merely object to. And so I like to remind people that sometimes we act in a world where beyond legality, right? Or not beyond legality in the sense of it is illegal, but beyond legality in the sense of it's not necessarily, there's actions that people can take that may at some point become illegal, but you could be in a gray area. And this is where we're operating here. So what this resolution did is it forced a vote of Congress to say, President Trump, you have to take the troops away. You have to remove forces. And now on a number of occasions, Congress has rejected that requirement in both the House and the Senate. The people voting sort of had differed a little bit here and there, but it's mostly Republicans, all Republicans voting to not constrain the president is, I think, the way they would present it. And the Democrats voting to constrain the president. Now, there's a lot of details here, both of legality and of politics and of accretions of institutional practice. So instead of going down some of those, I want to sort of leave it to you to tell me which of those to go down. But it is important to make clear that the limited legal meaning, the sort of minimum legal meaning, like a minimum viable product almost, of what that act in Congress was it was a refusal to say that the president must end hostilities or retract, or forces, depending on the individual wording, and the wording changes from resolution to resolution.
So since you have given us options, I think if we look back at the context of the war powers resolution, right, where, like you mentioned, the Vietnam War, Nixon, and even before that, we can go back to Truman, who also used his authority during the Korean War, right? If we look at it from an institutional angle, can we say that the war powers resolution of itself was it was a well-designed problem for it meant to solve, or did the Congress build on its own loopholes from the day one that would enable the executive?
So first, I think it's helpful to go back to, you mentioned Truman. You left a little egg there for us to pick up. So under Truman, so this is the Vietnam War where, I think there are various forms of the argument, but the American version is that China invaded South Vietnam and the U.S. supported a police action to stop that activity. The U.S. never declared war. The U.S. government, Congress provided funding, but never declared war. And so you have a couple of different histories in the United States of, sort of small conflicts that, you go take over a country in South America briefly, a customs office, and take the revenue from imports. You don't declare war for that. But this was the first time there's been in the Korean War was the first time there have been substantial deployments without a declaration of war. What you then had, through the Korean War, or through the Vietnamese War, was more and more American troops showing up, starting in the 50s, and then gradually taking over from the French in the French colonial position and having a full war. I was actually in Vietnam last year for the 50th anniversary of Da Nang falling to the Vietnamese, to the North Vietnamese. It was a fascinating time. I hadn't realized that was the day I was landing in Da Nang, but which was the headquarters of the American military presence. But so in this context, Congress passed something that said that a president has 30, and then that could be extended another 30 days to get congressional approval and must provide an explanation of the legal authorities used in a war powers report within, I think, 48 hours of the introduction of forces. Now, there are certain senses in which this was fighting the last battle, right? So, first of all, the sort of beating heart of the war powers resolution is introducing ground troops into a theater of war. Now, both of those, is a plane, ground troops, is a plane dropping bombs, ground troops. Well, in both in the Clinton administration, they said one plane dropping bombs was a particular introduction, and then it comes back and they report the introduction of forces after the plane's on the ground. And so there it's over. There's nothing to vote on. You can all go home. So what you saw was a legal and political structure that didn't keep abreast of the transformations in military technology. You also saw a structure that didn't keep abreast of the changes in constitutional structure. So again, this is 1973. In 1983, there's a Supreme Court decision, INS v. Chadha. Mr. Chadha, amusingly, was, I believe, a Ugandan or a Kenyan of Punjabi origin who kept getting thrown out of the United States and then coming back. Died a U.S. citizen, for what it's worth. But he, in this case, the core mechanism of the War Powers Resolution, of the congressional power of the War Powers Resolution, was undermined. So it used to be that Congress could say, the House and the Senate could say, no, that's illegal. But after the Supreme Court decision, you needed to essentially override a president's veto. So you needed 2/3 of Congress, which is, of course, what happened for the War Powers Resolution in the first place. But so in a certain sense, this legislation from 1973 has been not made obsolete, but it has not kept up to date with both the constitutional change and the military technology change, and to a certain extent, the geopolitical change, right? There has been a series of similar questions. Should we have done something on, should there have been a resolution on Venezuela? Would that have made sense? Some were introduced. This same mechanism, by the way, has been also used to force votes against the tariffs at various levels. With similar complicated politics, what does it mean that Congress has rejected those? Or actually, in a couple of cases, passed them to no effect?
So, you touched upon these various wars, but just to amplify this, could you speak about Obama's 2011 Libya intervention? Because there was pushback even from his own party. And even with, Secretary of State Clinton testifying that congressional authorization was not required. What made Libya a turning point? And do you think it sort of set a precedent for what President Trump is now exploiting? What made Libya sort of unique?
So there had been a series of missile strikes in the past in Iraq, sort of the first Iraq War, second Iraq War, some various things connected to, at least in the imagination of lawyers, to the global war on terror. The bombing of Libya was different in a number of ways, right? There was no obvious connection, no clear facial connection to the global war on terror. In the language of the United States, you have the 2001 and the 2002 AUMF. So the 2001 was in response to 9/11 and has been taken to authorize first the invasion of Afghanistan and then a series of strikes all over the world on people connected to Al-Qaeda or its derivative organizations. So the 2002 is substantially the Iraq invasion, and then some stuff in Syria and every once in a while Iran and things like that. Libya is none of those, point one. Point two, the argument made for that was in part that it was authorized by international law. Now, international law, that is, the UN had passed a resolution that at least the Russians have said pretty clearly, and I think the Chinese, although you all would probably know better, was a real mistake and abuse of the system. And so the position of the Obama administration was it was legal under international law, and therefore we don't need to worry about domestic law. And also that it was short enough that it wasn't really implicated in these war powers resolution questions and I forget the exact timelines went into this, but this was not a long-term air campaign in the grand scheme of things. And the US, this is where we get the famous line of leading from behind, where we're providing certainly the materiel, we're providing a whole series of support mechanisms, like in-air refueling and things like that. But the US was not necessarily at the front of the situation, and therefore not implicated for that reason also. I should say in that core logic was ultimately undermined by a vote of Congress, although again, it did not overcome a veto, related to U.S. support for the Saudis in bombing Yemen in I believe 2019, if I get my years right. So this question of what instrumentalities are connected to the War Powers Resolution is something that Congress has debated, but it's in the area of purely a political conflict, not a legal conflict. And that's not to say it's not a real conflict. I'm just saying we should understand that, it's angels on a pinhead kind of discourse, that until people are really willing to go to the mat over these political issues, and they almost never are, we're having a somewhat philosophical conversation.
Yep.
So, speaking of the specific question you mentioned, especially about the Obama thing, one of the key reasons why Obama administration gave for not triggering the war powers solution during those dates were also that there was no retaliation from the enemy side, right? That is also one of the reasons they gave, because the US uses such overwhelming force. Often there is very little retaliation from their adversaries, especially when it is, Obama's, say, even drone strikes against non-state actors. If we look at it from that angle, critics argue that the 60-day clock has effectively become a 60-day automatic authorization. The constraint became a permission slip of sorts, right? Do you agree with this characterization, especially with the changes in military technology and, all the related components of it?
I guess I would say this is Congress has not yet contested that frame, is the way I would respond. There was another case where this could have come up in two different occasions related to the Gaza situation in the Biden administration, and was never engaged, right? So one was you had a series of attacks on, a series of missile strikes on the Houthis, who were launching missiles and other things on ships going into the Red Sea, you'll recall. And some of those were described as needing a war powers report. And some of those were described as what we call an Article 2, that is the executive branch. Congress is Article 1, the presidency is Article 2, or the executive branch is Article 2. There's a philosophical difference there. But sometimes there's a notion of we don't need to provide a justification because it's force protection. So they were shooting at an American ship, so that doesn't need to be reported. But what you had in the case of the Houthis was a series of strikes over about 90 days where they kept providing war powers reports, that is, the reports you have to file within 48 hours of an activity, and describing those as part of a continuous mission, right? Now, the question, there's sort of two levels of question that could arise. One, Congress could have said this whole thing's illegal, and we're going to vote on this, and we're going to vote it down, right? No one introduced a resolution to that effect, much less held a vote. But that would have been a plausible position. But it's a position you articulate by introducing a resolution, offering, someone says, no, that doesn't meet the standard. And they would say the 30 or 60-day clock. And then they would have a vote in each chamber to interpret the rules on their own terms. No one did that, right? So there's a certain sense in which this question of 30 or 60 days at the level of a parliamentary process has never been interrogated, right? And then practically, and this is the question you asked, because no one's ever asking. Of course, it's a permission slip. Now, then there's the question of once you hit 60, what happens? But we went over 60, bombing the Houthis, and no one even cared, right? Now, even more stunning was this humanitarian pier where they spent $200 million to try to put a pier. Now, again, what is the test in the War Powers Resolution? It is the introduction of U.S. forces into a theater of war. I think Gaza counted as a theater of war. You're literally putting Americans on a thing up into Gaza. An American soldier died, got squished along the way. Again, no one filed a resolution challenging the legality. So I think there's this question: if none of the 435 members of Congress who have a pretty extraordinary diversity of points of view on this are willing to even have the question be asked and answered, what's it doing, right? What are we even talking about here? And, so you could find some lawyers in the executive branch at the State Department, the Office of Legal Counsel, and the Department of Justice who can come up with some, arcane philosophical argument that says it satisfies. But the only way there's only two ways you question that. One is you get in court, and the other way is you have Congress start voting on it and saying, we disagree with your understanding. And neither one of those has happened. So here we are. We get to live with 60 days because no one has the courage to fight over it. And there could be good reasons. I can defend, I think, you articulate a position for many of those 435, and I think I could come up with a defense that I even half believe for why you would take that position. But, so this tells me the mechanism doesn't work more than anything else.
So, even Republican senators like John Curtis and Mike Rounds have warned that they won't support the operations past the 60-day mark without authorization. These are Republican senators. Mm-hmm. So in your experience, you just spoke about it, but in this particular case, do you think those statements represent real sort of red lines, or is it just a way of signaling concern without, having to act on it?
I think we will. The difference between the conflict in Iran and in the Hormuz Straits and previous ones is that first there will be votes, right? Democrats are going to continue to find ways to force votes on this. And so we will probably find out. Second, the administration will continue to tell people it's under control, or, we have a ceasefire, or something like that. Now, if I were Trump or I were Hegseth, and let's say there was a substantial quieting of conflict, but there were, some shooting at ships as happened. I think we are April 20th, and there was a boarding of an Iranian vessel today. I guess you're April 21st. So you get some things that maybe someone could argue, oh, well, the conflict has ended, but there's a couple of enforcement actions, right? So I think a lot of it's going to depend on what the specifics of what's actually happening are at the time. A lot's going to depend on, frankly, the price of gas in the United States and, the sort of core politics. Those are going to be questions that are going to factor into the minds of Senator Curtis and Senator Rounds as they handle this. But I think what I see when I look at what the administration is doing is they're finding every attempt to, de-escalate would be a strong word, but to lower the temperature.
Yes.
And say that we're moving on. The purpose of which is essentially a political question. And if they succeed in making that political maneuver, that will probably also provide cover for Curtis or Rounds to pivot. Now, if the war is going full speed ahead, missile strikes going up, we're taking out every power station and bridge in Iran, then I think we're in a different world. But ultimately, it's that political question that we're dealing with. We're not dealing with anything like a sort of interpretation of the law as such, right? These are politicians deciding as a prudential matter where they want to spend their political capital. That's what the question is.
So I'm glad that you brought the political angle in the larger conversation which we were having about the institutional aspect of it. So in that political context, can we say that when we look at the Iran episode specifically, can we say does it reveal something new, or is it the same story playing out with a different cast? Because the 119th Congress was comparatively more active against, say, administration's actions in the cases of Greenland or even Venezuela. But the pro-Israel lobby is what makes this case particularly unique. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't think it has. I don't think Israel is a particularly good explanation and sort of pro-Israel lobby as such. I mean, I think there is a question. There was a question early on with Senator Rubio had an uncomfortable answer to a set of questions about why we were doing this in the first days. I actually think the reporting has been more unclear since then. I think the New York Times has done some very, very interesting deep dive reporting about sort of where and how this came from that actually suggests that while this has been a long-term priority of Netanyahu, there was actually a lot more American interest in driving this forward. And I think it's only historians will tell us where this came from. But I think actually the good comparison set is actually the tariffs, right? Because that's something for which there is concrete, Americans are paying more money in taxes because of the tariffs, and Congress has voted against it on something that is far away, even though it has a real impact on, say, energy prices. It's a much more tribal question, right? What team are you on? Are you supporting the president's judgment, right? The Democrats that are crossing over on this to not vote against Trump are the same ones that are doing this on other things, right? They are signaling their, I wouldn't say allegiances, but a sort of separation with the parties. So I think the way to understand this issue right now is, while it has become, I think all will agree, a problematic issue for Republicans as a political issue, it is not one for which there is a domestic political constituency, for the most part, for Republicans to break with the president, or Democrats, with the exception of, say, Fetterman or one or two more, to support the president. Unlike tariffs, where there's, the business interests and a sense of this is what's driving inflation. Of course, that is on gas prices. But I think that's actually helpful to see this, that it's much more like a pure partisan issue than even something like tariffs.
That was very enlightening, actually, because there is this whole, I'll not say conspiracy, but the Jewish lobby and the Israel lobby is something about which everybody speaks about. But another very influential aspect to all of this is ultimately the money. So we've all heard about the Congress's real leverage being the funds, the money for the war, the power of the purse. So why hasn't the appropriation sort of been used more aggressively? Is it because of a legal risk or institutional inertia or the politics of it?
Well, so this is another line. I mean, first, let's put this in the context of the broader war powers question, right? So if you were to say that the US military had exceeded its authorities over a period of time, but Congress continued to send money for those activities, what would it mean that they had exceeded authorities, right? Question one. And the administrations of both parties have taken the position that when Congress appropriates money, that's a sort of soft authorization of war. Now, this is not what Anil was asking, but I think it's important to start with that framework, that the president or the executive branch can plausibly make the argument that they are spending money in accordance with what Congress directed. Now, the place where the rubber meets the road on this is that the United States is running out of munitions, right? Or they have to do this game that they did with Ukraine of sort of rearranging where the munitions come from and things like that and playing redirections. So the thing the Trump administration is worried about is where does it get the votes for the 200 million it's asked for more munitions and things like that, right? And there we get the problem that there are no Democratic votes for that, and they'll probably lose some Republican votes on that for a variety of reasons. For some people, it's just because they're spending money, and there are some Republicans that just don't want to spend money. There's a series of questions, but the constraint on Trump is not these war powers resolutions. The constraint on Trump is where do they get enough missiles to keep shooting? How do they rebuild the stockpiles? How do they manage the pivot to other strategic situations? And so for them, I actually think that's the political challenge. How do they, at some point, it's not exactly that they run out of munitions because there's always substitutability and things like that. But they start to get real they start to get real operational frictions if they can't solve their political problem in Congress. And I don't think they can solve that easily. Now, the path that's been proposed is another reconciliation bill, right? So this is getting into an entirely different set of congressional budget process nerdery things. That's an entirely different thing. But right now, a whole bunch of immigration enforcement is happening via an alternative funding channel separate from the normal appropriations process. And in a certain sense, the Trump administration is proposing to move some military funding into that channel, which will be much more likely to be a pure partisan vote. And they'll put enough Christmas tree to get it through with Republican votes that they can have enough funding to do these operations, right? But this is where the political bite is. It's not on the other things. It's can they get enough money to fill the stockpiles? Can they get enough money to make operations not sort of degrade substantially because they have to spend so much time redirecting funds and moving pieces of material around. Does that make sense? Is that this is where the power is. This is and frankly, in American constitutional doctrine, there's this decision, famously the Steel Seizures case, Youngstown, in the 40s. Congress has its most power when it's fighting over its spending power, and it has its least power when it's fighting over other things. And so all the real fights are over, where does the money come from to do the thing? And can Congress throw enough wrenches in the process that the president has to come back and ask for easier paths to money?
The power of the purse.
So if we look at it from a perspective of be it US allies or even our audience who are outside the US in, say, the Indian subcontinent, Europe, the Gulf, what should they conclude about the reliability of US military commitments when Congress can't agree on whether war is even authorized, right? Does the institutional dysfunction at home translate into strategic unpredictability abroad?
I think there's a couple of layers to that question. So the first one is that treaty relationships are never self-executed, right? So to use America's tightest treaty relationship, which would be NATO, even if a NATO partner is attacked, you would still have to make the operational decision to send a set of troops over, right? There's no automatic, it's not like software that says, if this, do that, and troops go off and get deployed. So there's always going to be a political judgment. And I think it's fair to say that the reality I think Trump is the most stark reason to question this, but I think, frankly, there have been other reasons to question this in America's recent past. Now, as you move to other potential locations, you get questions, so if I were a Gulf country, I'd have a set of questions. Does America having bases there, having troops on the ground is really important. But can America provide the Patriot interceptors to stop Iranian drones? That's not even a political will question. That's in some sense a is it possible question. And, if they have to make a decision between giving those to somebody like Ukraine, or God forbid, somebody like Taiwan, and somebody like, Qatar, what decision do they make? That's a hard question. And if I were a strategic thinker in a place like, in a Gulf country, those are the questions I would worry about. And we've actually seen the Ukrainians try to step in and solve this and say, hey, look, we actually have great drone technology. We'll come and teach you how to fight drones. And so, this is a case where there's more than one actor that can play in this game. But, so there's a political question. There's a sort of not self-executing question. There's a question of, are there actually the resources to do the thing? And then there's the question of, would there be the political will, or what levers would actually be deployed? Because the United States always has many levers at its disposal, economic. I mean, we're even just seeing this in you're going to blockade, the Straits of Hormuz, we're going to too. And so there could be multiple channels of addressing this. But I do think if I were sitting there in the Gulf, or I were sitting there in South Asia, I would simultaneously be thinking, how can I ensure what actions can I take so that there's enough support in the United States to do what you would want them to do? How can I think through what political and military and economic options you can recommend that are, or you can ask for that are even executable, right? I mean, it's, and then you get into personality questions, right? But I think, I keep going back to, and various people saw this different ways, but when, during the Biden administration, then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who, while he'd been a hawk, shall we say, he'd been a sort of traditional, internationally aggressive Republican, he made a point of going on trips. And I remember one trip where he went to the Munich Security Conference to reassure, to be the Republican lead and say, we're committed. And then he went from Munich to the Gulf. And then he went to Saudi Arabia and said, we're committed. And I think one of the interesting questions will always be, where are the Republicans in Congress, not in their challenging Trump, but in their willingness to commit resources to do some of these things? And you've seen, even just in the last week, McConnell, who is the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, right? He's the person in the Senate who writes that bill for the amount of money, say something short of there's a blank check, but basically there's a blank check. And so sort of what does that mean? There, the constraint will more likely be the Democrats in that case, right? So even though Trump is this, in this moment, you have a story about Trump, I think in other circumstances, the politics will shift in other ways. Who will be the partner that does something? And to go back to, the flip side of the Libya story is the Syria story, right? During the Obama administration, where Obama said, well, if you send me a resolution approving attacks on Syria, well, then I'll do them. But if you don't send me one, no, it wouldn't be legal. right? So he wasn't, so this sort of reversed the logic of everything we said. He wasn't, and he's like, oh, you go do the work, and then I'll do my part, but wasn't lobbying for it, right? He wasn't like saying what he wanted. So I think those are the key questions that you're going to have to think about. And it's really important that podcasts like this are taking place because it gives people visibility into those kinds of decisions, and it helps leaders and publics think through those questions, right? And it's why it's so important to be in dialogue at the sort of civil society to civil society levels. You can understand this, but again, there's so many levels to the answers. There's so many levels of questions to answer. Anyways, I've belabored the point. I'm sorry. But I hope that's useful in sort of how I would think about that if I were in those shoes.
So, taking it forward to our last question of the podcast, if you were redesigning the War Pass resolution from scratch today, what would you change?
So I have put my name on proposals in the past that would require Congress voting on things and have more aggressive cutoffs. I'm not sure I think those meet the political moment. And I've been a leader. I testified to Congress on a number of occasions on a parallel reform package or a parallel set of questions related to national emergencies. That is, the tariffs are being implemented. Many of the tariffs are being implemented under the national emergency system. And I think there's a couple of possible ways you could address design problems in the War Powers Resolution. So one is you could tighten up reporting, right? So one of the challenges is that Congress and the public has very little visibility into what happens, either classified or unclassified. One of the ways in which the Trump administration has been different than previous administrations is that when it initiates a strike and files a War Powers report, it is filed, in some cases, only classified versions, not public versions. And that had never happened prior to the Trump administration, to my knowledge. So you could do some things to make the public reporting clearer. You could require, under certain circumstances, congressional approval. One, I do not think it would be politically viable to require approval, for missile strikes, for example. Like, I just don't think that's ever going to be in the cards. For introduction of troops into theater, yes, I could see that being possible. But then you have interesting, sort of self-defense questions. So something that became an issue in the first Trump administration is that we had troops in the African country of Niger doing, I forget the
Anti-ISIS operations.
Yeah. And training. And I mean, not even anti-ISIS, but really, sort of mill capacity building in Africa. And frankly, this is something we do across the continent. And that turned into a firefight in which a bunch of people, I think one American or two, were killed. And this question became, when does that become a war powers issue? Right? And no one's going to say Congress needs to vote on every mill training program that we run around the world. And no one's going to say when people are shooting, they need to stop shooting until Congress votes on it. Right? So there's an important line drawing question there. Then, but the sort of, we are going to affirmatively go send troops somewhere, we maybe having questions about use of certain kinds of weapons, maybe nuclear, maybe chemical, maybe biological, you would only do if Congress approved. There has been discussion, a retroactive mechanism, although I think you get into the questions we saw with Venezuela. It's like, who cares what happened yesterday? Now we're second guessing things. And that's just, so I think you struggle with viability. So I think that the focus probably has to be on what very high value actions, high value is a funny phrase, high
intention.
Yeah, high intensity. Yeah, it's, actions you actually want Congress to have a say in. What kinds of reporting around that? What, and then special mechanisms around funding that could allow for some easier questions to be raised. And then there's some consultation sorts of things. But there's in the War Powers Resolution, there's about 5 things that have to be done, only some of which happen only some of the time in various levels of compliance. But I think you have to look across the range of tools and see which ones you want to apply. And, I think it's fair to say that the core ones of consultation, reporting, spending are even then only used sometimes in various circumstances. But it's an incredibly hard policy question that I think frankly no one in the United States has a good answer to at the moment. So this is not like there's an easy answer sitting on the shelf. There's only very few people think there's easy answers, and not many people take those people seriously.
Thank you so much for that, Soren. I think we have had, our listeners have had an extensive overview and understanding of what war power solution entails and what are the complexities involved in the simple question that is being asked on why can't the Congress simply stop, Trump's quote unquote madness. All right. With that, I think we can conclude this particular podcast. Thank you so much for joining with us, Soren and Brigadier Raman. I hope to do this again in the future. And thank you so much also for our listeners for joining in.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.